Testament book, which is a book called, a genre of literature called wisdom literature. The idea being that ancient cultures, not just Jewish culture, but all ancient cultures felt that the way to live a content life, the way to be at peace with yourself and with others, was to amass wisdom. And so all these cultures put together different books. They collected all these sayings about different aspects of life, about how are you wise in your marriage? How are you wise with your children? How are you wise with your money? How are you wise with friendships? And they passed them down from generation to generation. And that's what this book of Proverbs is. It's a collection. And most of the book of the Proverbs is a parent, a father, and sometimes a mother talking to their child. And that's what these Proverbs are. They're parental wisdom. They're saying, listen, if you want a peaceful life, you'll listen to these words and you'll apply them. And you'll have a relationship with them. And actually, in Proverbs chapter 8, wisdom is personified as a woman, as a way to say wisdom is not just rules and regulations. It's not just a code that you follow your life by, but rather, it's being in relationship with God. And it's having a relationship where you can actually hear him. And when it comes to making a crucial decision in your life, you can hear clearly which way he's telling you to go and which is the wise way. Now, one thing we've done, I've done, and I didn't do it intentionally, but the first many weeks that we've been looking at wisdom, it's very much been, the only word I could come up with is navel gazing. It's very much been looking at our own selves, looking at our own belly button. You know, when you look at your belly button and you look at it and you say, is it an innie or an outie? And you kind of just pondering life but through your belly button. We've been navel gazing for many weeks now. We've been looking inward at ourselves and saying, you know, how does wisdom apply to things like anger that I have in my heart? How does wisdom apply to things like relationships that when somebody wrongs me, how do I forgive them? And navel gazing is totally fine. It's totally good to look at your belly button. Now you're all thinking about your belly button. Do you know if it's an innie or out? No, we're derailing. Anyway, I'll get back on track here. See, it's totally fine to do that. In a spiritual life, that's what we're prone to do. We're prone to look inward and ask questions of our own heart because we're hurting inside and we want answers and we want to figure things out in our life. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that spotlight from looking at our belly buttons and I want to turn it out. Because the book of Proverbs, as much as any other subject, talks about justice and the poor and the oppressed and the needy. And it gives us wisdom for the way in which we're supposed to react and interact with the poor, with the needy, and the ways in which we're supposed to fight for justice in this world. And actually, all those, Joe just read a lot of verses to us. That's not even half, I think, of all that I could have put on the screen of what Proverbs has to say about the poor. Now let me do a caution. Here's a caution before I get going here. Whenever you talk about money or the poor, I know that issues of shame come into your head, or issues of I'm not doing enough, or this pastor's just trying to get me to go do more. He's trying to make me feel bad. And that's not my goal. Believe it or not today, my goal is not to make you feel shame or feel bad for not doing enough. If you feel that way, just hold on to it, and I'll get rid of the shame and the guilt later on. Don't worry, I'll get rid of it. But you're bound to, whenever we think about our relationship to the poor, our relationship to the needy or the oppressed, we're bound to have issues of shame and guilt. And this is why, sadly enough, the Christian church hasn't done enough, at least the way Proverbs wants us, hasn't done enough to help the cause of the injustice in the world, to help the cause of the poor. But if you look at Proverbs 29:7, it says that the righteous, which is a synonym in Proverbs for wise people too, wise and righteous, it says the righteous knows the cares of the poor. And this word knows, actually, I'm going to criticize the English language a lot this morning because the English language does not communicate anywhere near the beauty and the nuance and the subtlety and the power and the glory that the Hebrew language does when it uses these words. So there will be times this morning when I will probably say this English word doesn't capture it, and this is one instance. It says that the righteous knows, and this word knows is the same word that we find in Genesis when it says that Adam knew Eve. It means it was vastly intimate. See, the writer of Proverbs is saying, if you're going to follow God, you must be radically and intimately knowledgeable of the cares of the poor and the needy around you. It says this is the requirement. You have to. It's not something you do on the side. It's not something you get to later once you fix yourself. The book of Proverbs says the righteous people, the wise people, intimately know, as a husband does his wife. They know the ways of the poor, and they care about it. And also, as you see, a lot of times our vision statements up on the screen at the beginning of service, for Soul Grace, this is very much a component, very much a core value. At the last line of the vision statement is that we are people who are serving the city of Seoul and beyond. And when I say serve, it means this, what Proverbs is saying today, about justice, about equality, about peace in the world. So let's jump into it. First, I want to ask 3 questions of it today. Why justice? What justice? And how justice? Why do it? What are we going to do when we do it? And how do we do it? And how do we do it? What's the right motivation? Let me jump in. First, why? Why justice? Why do we care? Why should we care about the plight of the poor, the needy, the oppressed, the downtrodden? Why? Well, Proverbs says this. Proverbs says in chapter 3, verses 19, that the Lord founded the world on wisdom. Okay? What that means is that when God created the world, and you see this in Genesis 1 and 2, he has a plan. He does it in wisdom, and he does it, it says, in understanding. It means this, at the very least, that God had a system and a plan and a structure and a path for this world. He did it in wisdom. We're not haphazardly bouncing off the walls, and we're not random molecules that are put together at the last minute. No, it says God founded this world on wisdom. And it even goes further, and it says the ways of wisdom, it says pleasantness, it should say life is a better word, and the last word is peace. The book of Proverbs in chapter 3 says, listen, God created this world, and he created this world for a purpose, and that purpose was to have peace. And here again, I'm going to criticize the English language because it doesn't capture what this word peace means. This word peace is a Hebrew word, one of probably my favorite, and it's shalom. And whenever you see it used throughout the Old Testament, shalom doesn't just mean peace like I like you, peace, or peace. It doesn't, our English word for peace is so weak. Shalom meant complete wholeness. It means utter interconnectedness. It means when God created the world, he meant for this world to have wisdom, meaning, purpose, and to be connected and to be woven together as you would weave a fabric. And I racked my brain for the best way to illustrate what shalom would look like. And the only way I can do it was a way that's going to make fun of myself, and that's okay. You can laugh at me. When I was in college, I did, in fact, take a course on craft making. I'll pause on that one. You guys can let that sink in. Yes, it was craft making. And I'm sure my parents loved the tuition bill for me taking a course on craft making. Now, that course taught me nothing, but it did teach me something about shalom, let me tell you. Because that craft making course, I had to learn how to make wicker furniture. I did. I'm not good at it. I forgot how to do it. But I learned the technique behind it, and this is what I learned. This is what you find when you have to make wicker furniture, and hopefully this will illustrate shalom to you. See, wicker furniture, if you know anything about wicker furniture has it's made of bamboo or rattan strips, right? Now, if you were to simply lay them side by side and glue them together or tape them together or something like that, you'd have a piece of furniture, yes. But structurally, it'd be very, very, very weak if you just laid this bamboo side by side by side by side. Instead, what wicker does, wicker furniture, the methodology of it, it says take those strands and interweave them. Lay one over the other, over the other, over the other, temper them down and connect them, weave them together. This is why even Psalm 102 says that God looks at the world as a garment, woven. See, what shalom is and what peace is the interwovenness of us together. Is God saying this world is interconnected, it's utterly weaved together in a beautiful pattern, and because it's woven together, it's infinitely stronger than it would be if you just laid them side by side by side. And so therefore, shalom for you and me, if we stand side by side by side, we're weaker. That's not the plan God wants. He wants our lives to be connected, to be woven together, to be put together. But see, Proverbs tells us in 11 chapter 1 that that's not the case. Something in the world's gone wrong. Chapter, if you have your bulletin, you can follow along. I put all the Proverbs there. Chapter 11, verse 1 says that false weights are an abomination to God. What Proverbs is assuming is that the shalom that was created for the world is now broken. And of course we know this. We look around and we see suffering. We see the poor. We see the oppressed. We see the needy. We see these people that need help. And we know that the way God wove the fabric, when he was making the woven fabric of this world, is now being unraveled. That's injustice. It's the unraveling of the shalom that God intended for this world. And it says in chapter 31, verse 8 through 9, that we who, if you believe in shalom, if you believe that this world was created for a purpose, and that purpose was interconnected peace, woven together, it says it's your responsibility then to go fix it. You and God are working together. We are working together. Chapter 131 says, speak up for those who can't speak up. Help those who can't help themselves. So why justice? Why should we care? It's because we say, God created this world for peace, connectedness as a garment, and it's being unraveled. And we cannot sit by. We must ravel it back together. And this is consequently, if you find that you don't believe in God, then there is really no basis for justice. There's no way to say, if you don't believe that God did create this world, and then he did it for peace, and he did it shalom, and he did it with wisdom, and he did it with a pattern and a path and a plan. If you don't believe that, then simply you say, I don't care about justice. You can't ever say this is the way the world ought to be when there was no ought to begin with. No, Proverbs says there is an ought. There is a way this world is meant and ought to be. And you and I are called to do it, to ravel it back together, to make wicker furniture together. So how do we do it? Well, Proverbs tells us in chapter 3, 27 through 28, and again, English fails us here. Sorry, but it does. It says, if your neighbor, don't withhold good, it says, from those to whom it's due. And that sounds like it says to be nice to people, and that's not what that word means. And actually, I took a quote from a commentator, Trimper Longman, who has a book written on Proverbs, and here's what he says about this word, quote-unquote, good. He says, when it says don't withhold the good, he says this is what it actually means. The good, he says, could be money or if it's equivalent, a tool that the neighbor needs, a certain type of expertise or physical aid. And he goes further. He says the good in this proverb is further identified as that which belongs to the person who has come to claim it. The point of this proverb is that the wise are attentive to the needs of their community, particularly those who live near them. What this proverb is saying is that you and I are required to look around our community to find those who don't have the resources that we have, and it is our obligation to give our resources to them. Now, if you come from a very Western American standpoint, that sounds a little scary at first, but accept it for what it is, because it says, to those to whom it's due, and that word due is a Hebrew word that means owns. It means that if somebody comes to you, or if you see somebody in need, they own what you have. Your resources are not your own. Your money is not your own. Anything you have, if your neighbor is too old to get up and turn on her heat, and you have the physical energy to stand up and go turn on her heat, you go and do it. It says your neighbor has a claim. And really, this is what justice is. Justice is when you and I look around us and we see the systemic social ills in our community, and we want to fix it, and we want to ravel it, and we want to give our time, and we want to give our money, we want to give our resources to see that the improvement of those people. Who does this? In chapter 11, verse 10, it says the righteous. I love this verse, and this is one that I wish, if you don't take anything else away from today's message, apart from the gospel, which I'll get to in a second, please take this away. Because this is, for a moment, I want to talk about what I want and what I would love for this community to be in this city. It says in chapter 11, verse 10, it says, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. And I thought about this for a long time. And I thought, that doesn't make much sense to me. When holy people prosper, the city rejoices? Think about it this way. If you were to go to work tomorrow or school or whatever, and if you were to say to your coworkers, I feel so holy now, I don't think that they would rejoice for you. I don't think that they would say, good, you feel holy, you're prospering. No, that's not what that means. It can't mean that. It couldn't. So I pored over tons of books for this and tons of lexicons, and this is what I found. This is how commentators describe this word righteous. It's a very, very enigmatic Hebrew word. And here, I'll just sum it up this way. They say righteous, the word righteous here means a group of people who materially sacrifice themselves. Those who are here willing to disadvantage themselves for the advantage of the community. See, the city's not going to rejoice if you and I just sit here feeling holy and prospering ourselves. No, the city's only going to rejoice when we disadvantage ourselves for their advantage. When we give of our material and sacrifice our lives enough that they look around and here's what, let me explain it this way. I would love if I came next Sunday and this church was filled with 500 people. It's not going to happen, but I would love it. But you know what I would love even more? And I'm being honest. I would love even more if people who never even stepped foot in this church would look at you and me and they would say, I don't believe what they believe. And I've never gone to this Soul Grace place, but I'm sure glad they're here because they're fixing things in this community. They're healing people. They are giving of their disadvantage so that others may advantage. I would love if somebody could say that about my life and about your life, about this community, saying, I don't believe what those people at Soul Grace believe, and I don't really like that much, but I know that if they're indispensable to this community. If they left, we would be the worse for it. That's justice. Giving, disadvantaging yourself for the advantage of others who need your resources. Now, how do you do this? At this moment, I said, whenever I'm talking about money or the poor, you're likely to feel like, oh goodness, this pastor is just railing on me now about all the things I don't do. I know I don't give my money to the poor enough. I know I don't help. And he's guilting me into going to volunteering at the orphanage this weekend. No, take that shame, and I want to get rid of it. And this is why. Shame is nothing more than external pressure that means no inward change. I could stand up here and shame you all into volunteering more, into giving more of your money. And it may last, and you may have a good fuzzy feeling for about 10 minutes after the sermon, and it'll dissipate because nothing's changed on the inside, just the outside. And Proverbs wants us to change from the inside. And here's how it does it. If you look back at on your bulletin at chapter 19, verse 17, it's got this beautiful passage that in and of itself, if we just read it, it would be beautiful, but there's a deeper meaning to it. It says, whoever lends to the poor lends to God. Do you realize how profound that is? That whenever you and I give to those who need it the most, we're giving it, it's almost as if we're giving it to God. God's saying, you are serving me now. That in and of itself would be a beautiful phrase if we didn't have Matthew chapter 25. And if you remember Matthew chapter 25, Jesus, he's talking to his followers. And he says, there's going to come a time when you come before God, and God's going to say, you fed me when I was hungry. You gave me something to drink when I was thirsty. You put clothes on my back when I was naked. You helped me when I needed it. And Jesus says, the people are going to look at God and go, what are you talking about? When were you hungry? When were you naked? When were you thirsty? And Jesus says, God's going to reply to them, when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. See, and then he looks and he says, there's going to be some people, and he looks at them and he says, you didn't feed me when I was hungry. You didn't give me something to drink when I was thirsty. You didn't put clothes on my back when I was naked. And the people are going to look at him and say, when did we see you like that? And he says, you walk by it every day. You see it every day in your community. The least of the people, those are the ones, if you don't serve them, you're not serving me. Here. Serving the poor does not get you a good relationship with God. But when you serve the poor, you know that you have a relationship with God because you've seen him poor first. Your and my attitudes towards the poor, towards the needy, it's a direct correlation to our relationship with God, he says. When you give something to them, you're giving it to me, he says. And we worship the only God who himself became poor. He was born in a manger as a poor baby, When he went to the temple to get circumcised, when he went to the temple, they didn't even have enough money to make a proper sacrifice, his family. They gave what would be a slave's offering of a couple of birds. And when he died on the cross, he died with only his robe and none of his friends and none of his possessions and nothing in his life. And he did it for you and me. See, I don't know how you worship a God who didn't enter into suffering. I don't know how you can worship a God who didn't go to the cross, who didn't die poor and oppressed. And you know, everything about Jesus' trial was unjust. Everything about his abandonment was unfair. And he did it. And he says, listen, I'm the only God who knows what suffering feels like. Because I experienced it on the cross. And I did it for you. Inasmuch as you and I can be moved by that, if that's the reality, that's not shame that moves us to serve the needy. That's compassion. Because we know how needy we were when God saved us. We can see him dying of injustice. We can see him naked on the cross. We can see him dying hungry and thirsty. And he says, look, I'm doing this for you. How can you not do this for others? Miep Gies, many of you know her name. She was an Austrian-born Dutch woman. And she, of course, helped Anne Frank's family survive. She hid them for the better part of 2 years in Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, in the apartment, in the office where he was working, and she hid them during the Nazi occupation. Because she knew, since they were Jewish, that if they were caught, they would be hauled off to the concentration camps and most surely would die. And Miep and her husband housed them, they fed them. She had to go around the city because she couldn't buy all the food for 8 people all at one store. The people would get suspicious. She had to spend hours of her day going around the city buying food from different locations just to cover up the fact that she was protecting these people in her house. And of course, we find out later, according to the diary of Anne Frank, they get caught, the family gets hauled off eventually, and Miep was the one who found the diary. She held on to it until Otto Frank came back, the father. He was the only one who survived. And because of that, we have this wonderful, beautiful tale written by a girl whose life was saved by Miep and her husband. And there's an interview that Miep gave, a very famous interview in 1997. And it talks about justice, and it talks about why and how you can do justice. Not shame. Compassion moved by grace. And here's what Miep said. It was an interesting interview because she was interviewed by 8- and 9-year-olds who submitted questions to her. And so it was a long interview, and all the questions were things like, how did you meet Otto Frank, and how did you protect him for so long, and were you ever scared, and things like that. And of course, the majority of the questions were, why did you do this? Because after all, Miep, by hiding the Franks in her house, she herself was subject to be shipped off to a concentration camp if she was caught. And of course, the natural question was, why did you do this? And here's what she says. There's an interesting answer, and I put the quote in your bulletin, but it gets even more interesting. Here's what she says. My decision to help Otto, meaning the father and his family, was because I saw no alternative. I could foresee many sleepless nights and an unhappy life if I refused, and that was not the kind of failure I wanted for myself. She says, permanent remorse about failing to do your human duty, in my opinion, can be worse than losing your life. And then somebody asked her, one of the kids asked her, did you ever consider just staying out of their business and letting them fend for themselves and just staying out of it? And she says this, of course. Initially, life is more comfortable if you stay out. You might silence your concern about injustice or cruel things happening to other people by telling yourself that those people should solve their problems themselves. It is a very selfish attitude, but as I said, safe in the beginning. So my conclusion, Miep says, is that really thinking of yourself is often better served by making some sacrifices today than having a miserable life later, feeling remorse about the help you failed to give those who needed you. She says, listen, I saw no alternative. But do you know what happened at the end of the interview? I love this part. One of these little kids, they knew about Miep's past. And they said, Miss Geese, how did being an orphan yourself change the way you looked at helping the Frank family? See, this little kid knew that Miep herself had been an orphan. She was born in Austria. She got sick as a child, almost to death. They shipped her off to Holland to a family, and the family nursed her back to life. They took care of her. They materially sacrificed for this child that they had no connection to. Later on, they adopted her. And you know what Miep's answer was? Because I was an orphan, I couldn't stand to see them orphaned. See, today the gospel tells you and me that we were orphans first. We were the poor, spiritually speaking. We were the destitute. We're the broken ones. We were the lost ones. And God took us in at the cost of his son's life. To the degree that you know that you were an orphan, brought into the family of God through the death of his son, you'll be like me. She says, because I was an orphan, I couldn't let them be orphans. And God says, because you were an orphan, can you not go out and serve the orphans now? To the degree that you and I know how bankrupt we are spiritually, how poor we are, how broken, and to the degree you and I know how poor he became on the cross for us, we will have sleepless nights thinking about taking care of the others in our lives who need it the most. God says, if you want to know what it means to serve the poor, look at the cross. Not your shame, not your guilt, not your obligation. That's the sacrifice given for you. How then can you not give the sacrifice for others? To the extent that we know how orphaned we were, we will never stop caring for the orphans and the poor and the oppressed. Spend some time in silent prayer now. Go to God and ask him, is this true of me? Did you really save me from a life of spiritual poverty to bring me into your family? And wait for him to answer, yes, yes, I did. Look at the cross as proof. Go in prayer now.